The empire looked unbreakable from the outside, red lines across maps, ports glowing with commerce, ships moving like clockwork across dark oceans. But inside the counting houses of London, confidence was already cracking. Victory was expensive, so was maintaining it. Every war left behind more than graves. It left invoices unpaid, stacked, waiting. The treasury rooms were quiet, heavy with ink and candle smoke. Clerks bent over ledgers, their fingers stained black, their eyes tired from adding columns that never truly balanced. Gold flowed out faster than it came in. Fleets demanded repairs, soldiers demanded pay, colonies demanded protection, and every demand arrived with urgency, never patience. Credit became the empire's second language. Loans whispered through corridors before they were ever spoken aloud. Private banks, merchant houses, foreign financiers, money promised today for stability tomorrow. But tomorrow never arrived. Only the next crisis, the next rebellion, the next war that could not be avoided because retreat was too costly and surrender even more so. Outside, the public saw flags and ceremony. Inside, ministers measured survival in interest rates. Inflation crept quietly like damp through stone walls. Prices rose in markets long before anyone explained why. Bread cost more. Coal became scarce. Wages stayed the same, families adjusted without being asked, meals grew smaller, children learned hunger before history, no speeches announced this sacrifice, it was simply expected. The empire did not collapse under invasion. It bent under obligation. Each loan was a promise carved into the future, binding generations who had no voice in the agreement. Decisions made in leather chairs would be paid for by hands calloused from factory floors and fields far from London. In distant colonies, the pressure was felt differently. Taxes tightened, production quotas rose, crops were chosen not for nourishment, but for revenue. Fields stopped feeding villages and started feeding balance sheets. Farmers signed contracts they could not read, backed by authority they could not refuse. Debt required discipline, and discipline required control. Soldiers enforced it, not always with violence, sometimes with presence. A uniform at the edge of a village was enough. A reminder that the empire's debts were not abstract. They were real, and someone had to pay them. Back home, mothers waited for sons who had been shipped overseas, not for honor, but because war was cheaper than losing influence. Letters arrived smelling of salt and smoke, describing cold nights, strange lands, and a constant uncertainty that felt heavier than enemy fire. Many never came back. Their absence became another unspoken cost, absorbed into the daily rhythm of survival. Governments spoke of necessity, of inevitability, of responsibility. But responsibility always moved downward. When confidence failed, credit replaced it. When credit thinned, exploitation followed. The empire learned to function not on belief in its mission, but on its ability to borrow time, to delay collapse, to keep the machinery moving one more year, one more campaign, one more shipment across the sea, and in that delay, something changed. Power stopped feeling permanent. It became anxious, reactive, hungry. Every decision carried the weight of previous ones. Every choice narrowed the next. The empire was no longer expanding from strength, but from fear of contraction. Fear of what would happen if the numbers finally stopped adding up. In rooms where maps still covered the walls, fingers traced borders not with pride, but calculation. Which possession could be squeezed harder? Which population could endure more? Which future could be mortgaged without immediate consequence? The empire stood tall, but it leaned on credit like a crutch, moving forward not because it trusted itself, but because stopping meant facing what it had already spent, already promised, already taken, and could never fully repay. War did not only demand courage, it demanded currency. Cannons were hungry, ships consumed timber, iron, and men. Armies bled money long before they bled soldiers. As conflicts stretched across continents, the empire searched for something more reliable than taxes and more immediate than victory, something that could be harvested, measured, sold, something that could turn soil into solvency. The answer grew quietly in distant fields. Poppies rose where grain once stood, pale flowers swaying under unfamiliar orders. Farmers were told it was temporary, necessary, patriotic. Contracts replaced choice. Seasons replaced freedom. The crop was not meant to feed families. It was meant to fund fleets. Hands that once planted food now planted obligation. In villages, the change felt sudden. Fields no longer belonged to hunger or harvest, but to schedules and inspections. Payments arrived late, and never matched the labor. Debt followed quickly. When crops failed, punishment came faster than mercy. The soil still worked, the people still labored, but survival became conditional. Ships waited at ports like silent collectors. Crates were loaded with care, sealed with official marks, documented in neat handwriting. This was not smuggling. It was policy, approved, calculated, protected by law and canon. The trade routes were guarded not because the cargo was fragile, but because it was essential to the empire's balance sheets. Every shipment represented a battle paid for in advance. In faraway lands, the cargo arrived quietly at first, then endlessly. Communities changed, labor slowed, streets filled with people chasing relief instead of work. Families watched savings dissolve into smoke. Authority weakened as dependence spread. Resistance grew, but it arrived late, fractured by the very trade that caused it. When objections were raised, they were answered with force. Warships appeared not to conquer territory, but to defend commerce. Treaties were rewritten under pressure. Ports were opened not by invitation, but by inevitability. The language of diplomacy hid the truth. This was not exchange, it was enforcement. Back in the empire, few saw the consequences. They saw stability, revenues rising, debts temporarily eased, another year bought, another campaign funded, another crisis postponed. The moral distance was measured in oceans. Families at home felt the war differently. Rations tightened, prices climbed, factories demanded longer hours, wives worked, children worked. The trade that funded war did not spare them. It only delayed their reckoning. Soldiers carried the burden in silence. Many knew what they were guarding. Few had the power to refuse. They marched under flags that promised honor, but were paid with wages that barely sustained life. They enforced routes that kept wars alive even as those wars consumed them. The empire spoke of necessity again, of survival, of lesser evils, but lesser evils repeated become systems. The poppy fields expanded, the ledgers grew thicker. War no longer waited for justification, it waited for supply. Battles were planned with revenues in mind. Campaigns delayed or launched, depending on how much the trade could cover. Strategy bent to income. The cost was spread thin enough to feel distant, but never disappeared. It lived in weakened bodies overseas, in exhausted hands at home. In soldiers who returned, changed, if they returned at all. The empire learned that war could be financed without asking its people directly, that suffering could be outsourced, that addiction, enforced at scale, could become an economic instrument, not chaos, not accident, but design. And with each year the trade continued, the line between defense and dependency blurred further, until war was no longer just something the empire fought, but something it needed to sustain the machinery it had already built. The battlefield was often decided long before the first soldier arrived, not by terrain, not by weather, but by numbers written in ink. Ledgers lay open on heavy desks, their pages filled with columns that determined where armies would march and where they would not. Each line represented a choice already made. Each total carried the weight of lives that had yet to be spent. Generals studied maps. Ministers studied debts. Some campaigns were delayed not because the enemy was strong, but because the treasury was thin. Supplies waited in warehouses while interest accumulated elsewhere. Guns sat idle while creditors demanded reassurance. War plans changed quietly, without announcement, shaped by what could be afforded rather than what was necessary. The soldiers never saw these calculations. They only felt the consequences. Units were sent, under-equipped. Rations were reduced, pay was delayed, promises replaced provisions. Men marched anyway, carrying not just weapons, but uncertainty, the knowledge that their survival depended as much on distant accountants as on courage in combat. In government chambers, urgency pressed against restraint. Another front demanded attention. Another ally needed support. But every decision was measured against existing obligations. Borrowing again meant deeper dependence. Refusing meant loss of influence. Retreat meant admitting weakness the empire could not afford to show. So the pen moved. Another loan approved. Another future pledged. Behind the numbers were human trade-offs. If funds went east, they could not go west. If ships protected one route, another was left exposed. Civilians in border regions waited for reinforcements that never came, not because they were forgotten, but because the balance sheet said no. In towns near the front, people learned to read absence. Fewer soldiers passing through, fewer supplies arriving. Rumors replaced information. Markets emptied. Hope thinned. They did not know why help had not come. Only that it had not. Debt created hierarchy among suffering. Some battles were fought fiercely because too much had already been invested to withdraw. Others were abandoned because the cost of holding them outweighed the political return. Lives were weighed against leverage. Entire regions became liabilities. At night, clerks worked by candlelight, recalculating what tomorrow could allow. They knew the figures were fragile: a bad harvest, a failed shipment, a delayed payment. Any disruption could collapse the careful illusion of control. War depended on confidence, and confidence depended on numbers appearing stable. Those numbers were rarely honest. Inflation hid shortages. Accounting tricks delayed panic. Money was moved between accounts to suggest strength that did not exist. On paper, the empire endured. On the ground, cracks spread. Soldiers sensed it first. Orders grew contradictory. Marches were rushed, then halted. Supplies promised failed to arrive. Morale faltered not from fear of the enemy, but from distrust of the system that sent them forward without certainty of support. Letters home grew heavier, not with fear, but with resignation. A quiet understanding that decisions were being made elsewhere, by people who would never hear the sounds of battle or smell its aftermath. Civilians at home felt the ledger's reach too. Taxes rose unexpectedly. Public works stalled. Wages lagged. The explanation was always temporary, always necessary, always framed as sacrifice for stability. But stability never arrived, only another demand. War budgets consumed futures. Children left school to work. Women filled factories meant to be short-term solutions. Elderly parents relied on dwindling assistance as funds were redirected to sustain campaigns whose outcomes were uncertain, but whose costs were immediate. The empire continued to fight, not always because it believed in victory, but because withdrawal would expose the truth behind the numbers, that the wars had been financed forward, with repayment endlessly postponed, that the battlefield was no longer just land and sea, but time itself. And as debts mounted, strategy narrowed. Choices became reactions. Movements followed money rather than momentum. The ledger, once a record, became a commander, quietly shaping where blood would be spilled next and where it would be spared, not out of mercy, but out of necessity, written in columns that never truly balanced. The fields were once alive with food, grain bending under the wind, vegetables pulled from soil still warm with sun, harvests that decided whether a family would survive the year. Then the orders arrived. Not shouted, not debated, stamped and signed. The land was measured, mapped, reassigned. Crops were chosen far away by men who had never touched the earth they now controlled. What grew was no longer a matter of hunger, but of revenue. The soil was repurposed, the seasons redefined. Poppies replaced sustenance. Farmers stood at the edges of their own fields, watching a future they could not eat. They were told it was temporary, that the empire required contribution, that compliance would be rewarded. Contracts were placed in front of them, written in a language they did not know, backed by authority they could not refuse. Refusal was not an option, neither was escape. Payment arrived in coins that vanished quickly. Taxes claimed their share first. Debts followed. What remained barely sustained life. Families adjusted silently, meals grew thinner, children learned early to quiet their hunger, the work never slowed, fields demanded constant attention, harvests were inspected, yields were counted, failure was punished, not with understanding but with fine seizures force. A bad season did not bring relief, it brought deeper obligation. The land kept producing, the people kept weakening. Markets changed. Food had to be bought instead of grown. Prices rose beyond reach. What once came from the ground now came from debt. Families sold possessions to survive the gaps between payments. Jewelry, tools, livestock. Each sale narrowed the future. Women worked longer hours. Children stopped schooling. Elders watched traditions erode. The crop they grew traveled far, sealed in crates, guarded by men with weapons. Its destination was unknown to those who nurtured it from seed to harvest. They only knew it left their villages and never returned as anything that could sustain them. Soldiers passed through occasionally, not enemies, enforcers. Their presence was enough, a reminder that the system was larger than any single life, that resistance would be met with consequences that communities could not survive. At night, families whispered about leaving, about rebellion, about survival beyond the fields, but the land held them. Debts tied them. Roads led nowhere without money or permission. The empire did not need chains. It had paperwork. Seasons passed. The soil grew tired, yields fluctuated, pressure increased, more acreage was demanded to compensate, less land remained for food. Hunger became routine, not crisis, a background condition of existence. Children grew up watching their parents work fields that fed strangers across oceans while their own bowls remained half empty. They learned obedience before hope, endurance before choice. The empire called this efficiency. It called it order. It called it contribution. But in the villages, it felt like disappearance, a slow erasing of autonomy, of dignity, of the belief that labor should sustain life rather than extract it. Funerals grew common during lean years, not from war, from exhaustion, from illness worsened by hunger, from bodies worn down by work that gave nothing back. Loss became normalized, absorbed into routine. Still, the fields bloomed, beautiful, useless, deadly in their purpose. Farmers continued to feed an empire they would never see, fighting wars they would never understand, paying debts they never incurred. Their labor became invisible once it left the ground, transformed into figures in ledgers that balanced elsewhere. And each harvest tightened the system further, binding land and people into an arrangement where survival depended not on nourishment, but on obedience, and where the earth itself became a silent witness to how an empire learned to eat without feeding those who kept it alive. The ships appeared on the horizon before anyone understood why. Dark shapes against the water, too large to be merchants, too deliberate to be passing through. They came slowly, confidently, their flags visible long before their cannons. The message was clear without a single word spoken. Trade would proceed, resistance would be corrected. This was not conquest, as history often imagines it. No grand speeches, no declarations carved into stone. It was enforcement, dressed in legal language, the right to sell, the obligation to buy, the insistence that markets remain open no matter the cost. Ports that had once governed themselves now felt smaller. Officials gathered in tense rooms, voices lowered, calculations whispered. They knew what refusal meant. They had seen it elsewhere. Cities shelled, not for rebellion, but for hesitation, for slowing commerce, for protecting their own people. Cannons were positioned with precision, aimed not just at walls, but at certainty, a reminder that trade backed by force was still force. Sailors waited at their posts, trained for battle, yet ordered to stand ready for something less visible. They were told this was peacekeeping, stability, protection of lawful exchange. Few questioned it aloud. Fewer still understood the full purpose. They followed orders that had been justified long before they arrived. Inside the ships, the air was thick with oil and discipline. Men slept beside weapons they hoped not to use. They stared at unfamiliar coastlines, wondering why a marketplace required artillery, why commerce sounded like war. On land, civilians felt the tension before the first shot. Shops closed early. Families stayed indoors. Word spread quickly through streets and harbors. Negotiations were failing. Demands were firm. Time was running out. The empire's representatives spoke of balance, of treaties, of fairness. But the terms were non-negotiable. Open the ports, accept the goods, submit to the rules already written elsewhere. When resistance came, it was brief. A warning shot, then another. The sound shattered more than walls. It broke illusions. Any remaining belief that trade was voluntary dissolved in smoke and splintered wood. People ran, not from invasion, but from inevitability. Behind every cannon fired was an account waiting to be settled. Each blast justified as protection of economic order. Each explosion translated into leverage. The language of diplomacy ended where gunpowder began. Soldiers moved through streets that smelled of fear and salt. They were not there to occupy, they were told, only to ensure compliance. But compliance required presence, and presence reshaped daily life. Curfews appeared. Inspections became routine. Authority shifted quietly, without ceremony. In distant capitals, reports arrived neatly summarized. Resistance subdued, trade secured, losses acceptable. The violence was reduced to paragraphs, stripped of faces and voices. The balance sheets responded immediately. Confidence stabilized. Credit extended further. At home, the public heard little. Newspapers spoke of securing interests, of maintaining peace, of protecting national prosperity. The cost remained abstract, far away, manageable. But in the port cities, life did not return to normal. It adjusted. People learned which ships to avoid, which goods could not be refused, which questions were dangerous. Commerce continued, but under watchful guns. Children grew up knowing the sound of naval fire as part of the landscape, not constant, but always possible. a reminder that the rules of trade were written in metal. The empire framed these actions as necessity, as defense of principle, as the price of global order. But order maintained at Cannon Point carries a different weight. It reshapes trust into compliance, choice into obligation. The sea remained calm, the ships stayed anchored, and the trade moved forward, protected not by agreement, but by the quiet understanding that refusal had already been answered, and that the sound of cannons had become the final argument in a world where commerce claimed to be free. They were told they were fighting for victory, for crown, for country, for history. But when the boots hit the ground, survival became the only truth that mattered. Soldiers arrived thin from the journey, uniforms already worn by salt and rain. Many had never left their villages before. Now the air smelled different. The soil felt chooge unfamiliar underfoot. Orders came quickly, explanations rarely followed. They learned fast what the speeches had not prepared them for. Rations were never enough. Pay arrived late or not at all. Boots wore through before replacements came. Letters from home spoke of hunger, of rising prices, of children working instead of learning. Every word carried guilt heavier than any pack. They fought with the knowledge that retreat was not an option, not because of honor, but because there was nowhere to go. Home no longer existed as it once had. War had reshaped it from afar. Nights were the worst. Cold settled into bones. Silence stretched until it broke with distant fire or sudden orders. Men whispered about debts they did not understand, about why they were holding ground that offered nothing but exposure. They wondered who decided this hill mattered more than their lives. Behind every command was scarcity. Supplies were calculated, rationed, delayed, ammunition counted carefully, medical care prioritized. Some wounds waited too long, some men waited forever. Survival depended on logistics as much as bravery, and logistics bent under financial strain. They learned to fight tired, hungry, uncertain. Orders shifted without warning: advance, hold, withdraw, then return. Strategy changed as funding shifted. Soldiers sensed it even if they could not name it. The war felt reactive, unstable, driven by pressures they could not see. In battle, survival narrowed to seconds, to instinct, to the man beside you. Victory became abstract, a word spoken by officers far from the front. What mattered was making it through the next hour without being the one left behind. The dead were buried quickly. Sometimes not at all. There was no time, no space, no ceremony. Names blurred, faces faded. Loss became routine, absorbed into the rhythm of marching and waiting. Those who survived carried more than scars. They carried the weight of decisions made in rooms they would never enter. They guarded trade routes they would never use. They enforced systems they barely understood. And when doubt surfaced, it was pushed down by exhaustion. Fear was constant, not just of the enemy, but of abandonment, of running out of supplies, of being ordered forward without support, of realizing too late that survival was never the priority. Letters stopped arriving for some. Others received news they could not respond to. A parent gone, a child born and already working. Home moved on without them. When reinforcements failed to come, they filled the gaps themselves. When pay was delayed, they shared what little they had. Bonds formed not from ideology, but from necessity, from the shared understanding that no one else was coming. Officers spoke of discipline, of duty, of endurance. The men practiced all three, not out of loyalty, but because survival demanded it, because breaking formation meant death, because disobedience meant punishment they could not afford. In moments between battles, they stared at the horizon and wondered how much their lives were worth on a ledger, whether the ground they held balanced a column somewhere, whether their hunger translated into profit. They fought on because stopping was worse, because the machinery of war had momentum, and being crushed beneath it was easier than stepping aside. Survival became an act of resistance against a system that needed them alive just long enough to keep moving, and expendable the moment the numbers demanded it. The war did not begin for them with gunfire. It began with absence. Bread that no longer filled shelves, coal that arrived late, letters stamped with apologies instead of explanations. Civilians felt the shift before anyone named it. Prices crept upward quietly. Wages stayed still. Markets grew tense. People learned to count coins twice before spending them once. Ration cards became part of daily life. Thin paper standing in for certainty. Each mark meant a meal delayed, reduced, or replaced with something cheaper. Families adjusted without complaint because complaining changed nothing. Hunger was not dramatic, it was persistent. Mothers stretched meals with water and patience. Children learned to eat slowly, to make food last longer than it should. Elders remembered fuller times and said nothing. Pride was swallowed before food ever was. Work intensified. Factories demanded longer hours. Fields were harvested harder, faster. Exhaustion became ordinary. Injuries were ignored. Rest was a luxury few could afford. The war needed output, and output came from bodies that did not get to choose. Taxes rose in ways few understood. New levies appeared with official explanations that sounded reasonable and distant. Necessary, they said, temporary. But necessity kept returning, and temporary became permanent. Homes changed. Rooms grew colder to save fuel. Furniture was sold. Curtains blocked light at night, not for comfort, but compliance. Cities dimmed themselves into submission. Silence replaced conversation after dark. News traveled slowly, unevenly. Official updates spoke of progress, of resilience, of unity. Reality spoke through empty plates and worn shoes. People stopped trusting words and trusted their eyes instead. Families waited, for sons sent away, for husbands promised return, for news that often never came. Every knock on the door carried weight. Every delay in post sparked fear. Some letters arrived months late, describing moments already past, written by hands that might no longer exist. Others never arrived at all, leaving questions unanswered forever. Women carried much of the burden quietly. They worked jobs once closed to them, then returned home to manage scarcity. They stood in lines for hours, negotiating with clerks who had nothing left to give. They held households together with resolve and exhaustion. Children adapted faster than anyone. They learned which questions not to ask. They learned to work early. They learned that childhood could wait. Education paused. Play disappeared. Responsibility arrived uninvited. The war entered kitchens and bedrooms without permission. It decided what could be eaten, worn, saved. It shaped daily routines more completely than any battlefield map. Civilians became participants without uniforms, carrying costs without recognition. Some resented it. Most endured it. Anger required energy they did not have. As shortages deepened, communities relied on each other. Neighbors shared what little they could spare. Small kindnesses carried disproportionate weight. A loaf divided, a coat passed down. These gestures did not solve the problem, but they softened it. Behind closed doors, worry accumulated about debt, about the future, about whether sacrifice would be rewarded or simply forgotten. People sensed that the war was being paid for in places like their homes, even if they could not see the accounts. The strain showed in faces, lines deepened, eyes dulled. Laughter became rare, careful. Grief settled into routines rather than moments. Still, life continued. Work, wait, endure. Civilians carried the war not with weapons, but with patience stretched thin. They absorbed shortages, losses, and uncertainty without ceremony. Their contribution was never written in orders or medals, but it sustained everything else. And as the conflict dragged on, it became clear that the hunger was not accidental nor temporary, but part of a larger calculation where suffering was distributed quietly, efficiently, and far from the rooms where decisions were made, leaving ordinary people to pay for distant choices with their bodies, their time, and the futures they slowly learned to expect less from. Treaties were signed behind heavy doors. Ink touched paper in rooms filled with smoke and quiet tension. Maps lined the walls. Gold lay in chests. The air smelled of parchment and expectation. Decisions were made without witnesses, decisions that would echo across continents. One signature could redirect armies. One clause could open ports, close markets, or dismantle cities. Yet the faces in those rooms never saw the streets emptied, the fields abandoned, the families that bore the consequences. Negotiations were never calm. Every word carried threat. Every pause was calculated. Officials spoke of fairness, of justice, of compromise, but compromise was defined elsewhere. The stronger pen dictated terms, and the weaker hand was left to obey. Ports, once self-governed, fell silent under inspection. Wharves that had bustled with trade now moved according to schedules imposed from afar. Ships unloaded goods that citizens neither wanted nor could refuse. Customs officers recorded the transactions, aware that enforcement had arrived before consent. Resistance was quiet. A merchant hesitated. A local council hesitated. And the answer was swift. Ships appeared. Cannons braced on decks. Soldiers stationed themselves where they had never been welcomed. Orders were clear. open the markets, accept the terms, or suffer the consequences. Commerce was protected not by law alone, but by the ever-present threat of force. In villages inland, news traveled slowly but carried weight. Families realized their autonomy had been curtailed before they understood why. What they grew, stored, and nurtured might never feed them. What they owned could be redirected to satisfy debts written on paper they could not read. Officials back home frame this as prudence, strategic necessity, a requirement for maintaining order. But in reality, these treaties acted as instruments of control. They shifted power from local communities to distant capitals. They bound entire regions into obligations they had no part in shaping. Soldiers enforcing compliance often carried unease as well as weapons. They knew the people they were guarding were not enemies. They saw fear and exhaustion in faces of civilians who had done nothing but survive. Orders demanded action without empathy. Compliance was enforced, humanity often ignored. Every port opened under duress, every city coerced into trade, every signature on paper distant from the suffering it caused tightened the web of the empire. Boundaries were less about geography and more about influence. Sovereignty became a concept defined not by choice, but by what could be forced through commerce backed by guns. Officials calculated risk in rooms without windows. Every clause in the treaty had consequences, immediate or deferred, visible or hidden. Some benefits arrived to the empire almost instantly: revenue, influence, leverage. Others were delayed, subtle, yet no less transformative: societal dependence, altered economies, weakened autonomy. For civilians, these distant decisions were intimate: a ration delayed, a shipment redirected, a village forced to produce for strangers. Life adjusted around obligations it did not consent to. Children grew up watching authority arrive in strange uniforms and strange words. Adults learned that survival required obedience, even when it defied logic or morality. Every daily action, harvest, trade, travel, was constrained by the unspoken enforcement of distant treaties. Even those who understood the economics felt powerless. Debts calculated in foreign offices dictated harvests, markets, and labor. The empire had mastered the ability to translate ink into influence, to turn signatures into leverage, to enforce obedience silently, efficiently, invisibly. And as the days passed, the weight of these invisible chains settled into routines. Life continued, measured in compliance and caution. Yet beneath the surface, resentment and quiet despair grew, recorded nowhere, but present in every gaze and every worn hand. Profit was counted first. Men and women in distant offices tallied numbers on paper, columns of figures that dictated who lived and who labored. Ships carried wealth across oceans while lives waited in towns, fields, and ports, unsure if their work would ever be enough. Ledgers grew thicker than histories. Every shipment, every tax, every coin was tracked, calculated, and repurposed to sustain something far beyond the human eye. Each entry represented sweat, hunger, and time that could not be recovered. The empire celebrated its balance sheets. It measured success in pounds and interest, in contracts signed and markets opened. But behind each figure were faces, bowed by labor, hollowed by worry. The world of profit was clean. The world of people was messy. Farmers pushed their tools through soil no longer their own. Fields grew for distant coffers, not for the families who depended on them. Every harvest that left their hands carried away more than goods. It carried possibility, freedom, and sustenance. Children ate less so ledgers could balance. Parents labored longer so ships could sail on time. The numbers demanded it, and they obeyed. In cities, markets reflected an illusion of normalcy. Streets were crowded, trade appeared constant, prices fluctuated in patterns that seemed natural. But beneath the surface, the weight of economic extraction pressed quietly on everyone. Wages stagnated, food became expensive, clothing and fuel vanished into the same channels that carried the empire's fortune abroad. Governments justified every calculation as necessity. Without profit, they claimed, the empire could not survive. Yet the pursuit of profit created casualties invisible to those counting it. Individuals sacrificed health, time, and hope so that distant decisions could be sustained. Survival became a ledger, and the lives of ordinary people were the collateral. Soldiers bore it in a different way. They fought campaigns that had been bought with opium, taxes, and loans. They marched to protect routes for which they were never compensated fully. Their pay arrived sporadically. Their letters home arrived later, and when they returned, they often found their families changed or lost or struggling under the same invisible weight they had carried overseas. Every step of commerce was enforced. Ports were guarded. Contracts were upheld with the implicit threat of guns. Treaties guaranteed profit, not protection. Power became measurable in transactions rather than trust, in revenue rather than loyalty. Human cost was reduced to abstraction. Even those who profited felt no satisfaction. The empire's wealth was never secure. Every shipment delayed, every rebellion suppressed, every market opened came with constant pressure. The pursuit of profit required vigilance, calculation, and often cruelty. The system demanded compliance from those far below and oversight from those far above, a web where anyone could be sacrificed for the sake of continuing the cycle. Families learned to adjust to absence. Fathers gone to defend trade, mothers stretched resources to compensate, children silent in understanding that survival required adaptation. Loss became routine, grief absorbed quietly, streets filled with faces that had been trained to endure scarcity, to keep laboring, to keep feeding numbers that were not theirs. And so the empire's wealth grew, but the world it relied upon did not flourish. Human bodies and spirits were consumed to produce stability on paper. Hunger and exhaustion became invisible taxes, unpaid and unacknowledged. Civilization itself bent to the calculations of profit. The machinery moved with precision, ships sailed, markets adjusted, ledgers balanced. But every coin, every contract, every pound carried human experience. Faces bowed, hands blistered, hearts hardened. Profit counted, human cost ignored, yet silently it accumulated in ways no ledger could fully capture. The empire's successes were undeniable. Its influence stretched across continents. But each achievement was shadowed by labor forced, lives constrained, and futures exchanged for immediate gain. In the quiet moments between shipments and signatures, the toll whispered in homes, on roads, and in fields, where ordinary people paid in ways invisible to the very system that depended on them. The empire won battles it did not deserve to fight. Flags waved over conquered lands. Cannons roared. Guns flashed. Soldiers marched with precision. The maps were redrawn and borders shifted, each line meant to signal power, to mark dominance. But victory came quietly elsewhere, far from the cheers. In offices lit by candle and ink, decisions were made in pounds, not blood. Gold was moved, loans were calculated, trade routes secured. Success was measured in profit, in balance sheets, in ledgers that would never speak of the human cost. Families in distant towns felt it first in absence. Bread was smaller. Coal arrived late. Children grew quiet as parents stretched resources thinner than ever before. Meals were calculated, not enjoyed. Every coin counted twice. Soldiers returned home from faraway fields changed. Their eyes carried exhaustion that words could not express. Limbs ached from marches demanded by battles dictated not by strategy alone, but by the money available to sustain them. Letters home told of survival, of fear, of comrades lost, but the true story was read between the lines. The empire's victories were funded by debts and contracts. Every successful campaign had been bought, borrowed, or coerced. Armies were fed with borrowed grain, weapons polished with borrowed iron, fortresses repaired with loans. The people who lived under its shadow paid in invisible ways, unseen by the triumphant banners that hung over cities. In distant colonies, the consequences were even more tangible. Farmers grew crops not for their children, but for markets elsewhere. Taxes rose without warning. Labor stretched into nights with no rest. Communities adapted to absence and scarcity, learning to survive under systems they could not control. Every transaction enforced by distant authority altered daily life in ways that were silent but profound. Civilians adjusted quietly without ceremony. Fathers worked longer hours. Mothers rationed more strictly. Children learned endurance before education. Hunger became routine, grief became habitual, and the weight of empire pressed down in ways that were never recorded, never praised. Governments spoke of honor, of necessity, of empire. But necessity had a face, scarred, thin, exhausted. And honor was measured on maps and in ledgers, not in homes or fields. Every policy, every decision rippled outward, shaping lives that had no voice in the rooms where it had been made. Even the victories on the battlefield carried cost. Armies occupied, enforced, and extracted. Soldiers became instruments not only of war but of economics. They guarded trade routes, enforced compliance, and protected profits that sustained campaigns long after flags had waved and cannons had fallen silent. The machinery of empire was relentless. Ships sailed, markets opened, treaties enforced. Success was immediate, tangible, celebrated. But each triumph came at a distance, measured in human endurance, sacrifice, and labor that would never be acknowledged on the maps or in the official histories. In towns and villages, people watched the empire's power grow while their own futures shrank. Fields emptied, hands blistered, stomachs ached, and yet they carried on silently, obediently, because survival demanded it, because defiance was not an option, because the victories they saw from afar were built upon the invisible suffering they could neither avoid nor escape. Every cannon fired, every treaty signed, every trade route enforced reinforced the truth. An empire's glory was inseparable from the quiet burdens it imposed. And while victory shone brightly on maps and flags, it cast long, dark shadows across the lives of those who had financed it, endured it, and lived under it, day by day, quietly, without recognition.